Getting bigger by being better. The number one choice for Bristol. This is BCFM 93.2.
On to the Minsk agreement now then, Martin, and this is the biggie from the week from the international news. The leaders of France, Germany, Ukraine and Russia all getting their heads together to decide what's going to happen in eastern Ukraine. And there's a ceasefire Saturday evening, I believe, just going to start. The big question is it going to hold this ceasefire?
Well, the previous ceasefire has been undermined largely from the Ukrainian side. The rebels...
From Kiev, yeah?
From Kiev. And the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, have basically taken advantage of that to try and gain territory and so on before the ceasefire kicks in. What was missing from the Minsk agreement are two crucial elements. One is the rebels themselves. Putin doesn't necessarily speak on their behalf, and he cannot guarantee that they will sign anything. All he can say is, I will ask them to sign it and I will recommend it, but that people shouldn't assume that these people are puppets of Putin. It's quite possible that they will be taking a harder line than Putin himself is taking. Well, also, more than likely, in fact. Also,
the Crimea is cited all the time as, Putin's annexed Crimea. Just to explain for a minute the strategic significance of Crimea, because this is where the Black Sea Fleet is based, isn't it? And that is actually quite important, involved, for example, in the conflict in Syria and Israel.
Well, it's a crucial part of the Russians' strategic posture is to control Crimea. But the fact is, I just read a thing about an opinion poll carried out by a pro-Western German opinion poll organisation, which showed that something like 85% of people in Crimea now are still determined to be part of Russia, do not want to be part of the Ukraine. And so, in many ways, Putin's hand was forced there by sentiment on the ground. The idea that Putin and the Russian government are orchestrating both what's happening in the Crimea and in eastern Ukraine is simply wrong. Well, look, the people there are taking a harder line than the Russian government in Moscow.
The crucial thing that's being compared to is the annexation, the Nazi annexation of Austria or the Sudetenland. These kind of annexations.
Well, I mean, but that's each case is uniquely different, and all of this stuff going on about how Putin's the new Hitler is laughable. In Kiev, in the key ministries of military and intelligence and police are being run by neo-Nazis who openly identify with Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. They are the ones who are trying to annex the eastern Ukraine and Crimea, and they don't want to be annexed. The analogy is simply wrong.
Okay, let's compare this, for example, to Catalonia. For example, they're thinking that they don't really want to have much to do anymore, in fact, with Madrid, because people all across Europe are starting to say, well, hang on a minute, we're paying loads of money in tax, but we're not seeing our infrastructure being built, and it's not being spent, it's just going to pay debts now.
Well, look, there are each of these conflicts is unique. There are elements that are similar, and there are elements which are unique, and you can't just read off from one conflict to another or whatever. When Yugoslavia was broken up, you could argue that breakaway republics should not have been encouraged by Western policy to simply walk out of Yugoslavia, leaving other republics still in Yugoslavia, who then had to walk out subsequently with a lot of bloodshed of all kinds. And of course, the Indian Federation are looking at this with alarm because they've got secessionist tendencies, whatever. I think all of these things are manageable, as the Northern Ireland crisis has ultimately been manageable, if there is a willingness to listen to different sides' point of view and to recognise that there's going to be differences in those points.
So how do we decide? I mean, for example, in Spain, here we got also in Ukraine, in Yugoslavia, as you were talking about. How does a region decide whether it's actually got the right to secede from the centre when they've had enough?
You've got to decide whether it's where do you draw the border of a region? I mean, I would suggest that the rebels in the East Ukraine are probably, in their aspirations, wanting to liberate further areas of Ukraine where people are in sympathy with their views. And of course, I think the strategy at the moment is to get Luhansk and Donetsk, liberated from Ukraine in the sense of not being run from Kiev. Although the Russian government are insisting that they see Putin's interest is to have them in the Ukrainian Federation, so that they can vote in Ukrainian presidential and parliamentary elections, and therefore dilute the potentially far right element coming in from the West Ukraine. Although in Galicia, which is even the very far west of Ukraine, they are thinking of a seceding as well. And it's quite possible that the Ukraine, which is a state that's only existed since 1991, will simply not exist. That happens all the time. It's possible that the United Kingdom, which has existed since 1707, won't exist by the end of 2015. The world is changing. The point is, all of these things are negotiable, as the Northern Ireland peace process shows. By a common sense attitude all round, it's possible to come to agreement. But what's happened here, a bigger picture, is that the neocons in the United States of America want a crisis in the Ukraine to tie the Russians' hands. Brzezinski, the advisor to Carter from the 70s, he's saying he wants to send weaponry to Ukraine which will allow them to carry out urban warfare and bog down the Russian forces in urban warfare in the big cities in the Ukraine. That's the kind of way they're talking. And a war in the Ukraine suits their book because it ties Putin's hands, which allows us to carry on promoting war in Syria and across the Middle East. What we've got, in fact, is a war-mongering oligarchy in the West.
But you say in the West, but are the Europeans going to have this war? The Americans certainly want them to.
Well, the Europeans are the ones who are going to have to fight it. The Americans are just the ones who want to supply the weapons.
So what about the Germans and the French? Do they want it?
This is a question, isn't it?
The leadership?
I think they have been pushed into a very difficult position. I've been reading some very interesting things about Merkel and Hollande's visit to the Kremlin, because they went into a conflab with Putin and Poroshenko. Well, Poroshenko came along in Minsk, but they were in Moscow with Putin, and all the officials, apart from translators, were removed. And of course, in the Kremlin, Merkel and Hollande can be pretty confident that the NSA can't be listening to what they're saying. Now, the positive spin on that is that Merkel has been advice from previous German chancellors, advice from her industrial base and so on, saying, look, we don't want a war with Russia, fix it for us. But on the other hand, in public, she's still banging the same old drum about Putin's got to do this, do that, do the other.
I thought, hang on, the NSA are bugging her phone, aren't they?
Yes, but presumably the Russians will have asked her to turn her phone off before she went into the meeting. But this is a potentially important turning point. If the Germans, and they're using the French as cover, we're talking about the Germans here, the Germans need to get sensible in the way they deal with the Greeks, and they need to get sensible they deal with the Russians, and they need to get a bit more realistic about the way they deal with the British and the Americans. Like, basically, our time in Britain and America of telling the Germans what to do is over. And it's the Germans' responsibility to keep the peace here and to tell the warmongers in Washington and London that we're not going down that road. And I hope Frau Merkel has the backbone for it.
We've just heard a couple of hours ago on the BBC News website, Ukraine crisis, fierce fighting after the Minsk peace deal. Intense fighting has been reported in eastern Ukraine a day after the peace deal. Fiercest battles were over control of the town of Debaltseve, a strategic town in between rebel-held areas. The group responsible for monitoring the ceasefire, due to start at midnight on Saturday, said there's still serious live fire in several areas.
Well, the point is that before a ceasefire kicks in, everybody fights to try and get as maximum territory as they can before the ceasefire kicks in. If the ceasefire kicks in and it holds, it will be because Putin is restraining the rebels. The rebels, in fact, are on a roll. And they would like to carry at this point. Kiev was breaking the ceasefire all along. The rebels agreed to the ceasefire last September. Kiev kept on provoking them, and that's because they are being pushed by the Israelis and by the Americans to keep the war in Ukraine boiling, to keep Putin busy, so that they can move their other pieces on the chessboard in the Middle East. Very unfortunate for the Ukrainians. But, I mean, this is all turning, it's almost like we've reached the point now where there is no turning back. The Ukrainian economy is collapsing. There is going to be a showdown economically and politically across the world. It's going to be a shock. This
is pretty nerve-wracking, isn't it? Because we've had Saddam, the bogeyman, we've had Gaddafi, the bogeyman, Assad, the bogeyman. Now it's Putin, the bogeyman. This could go nuclear.
It could, but more likely it's just going to go conventional, at which point the Russians are in a very strong position to win. The question is, will NATO accept defeat without using nuclear weapons? And I don't think people like John McCain come across as having any common sense about this whatsoever. But there's a kind of groupthink taking control in America now, where they see arming the Ukraine as a test of virility. I think that alarms the Germans, who are a rather conservative disposition, which is why they don't like printing money and they don't like going off to wars which they can't, which they don't want to get themselves into.
Yes, but they've printed the money. Will they go for the war as well?
Well, what they need to do is show more flexibility with Greece, They're trapped by their own rhetoric. The idea that Putin started this crisis is patently wrong. This crisis was begun by the neocons in Washington who worked with the far right in Ukraine to overthrow the democratically elected government by shooting protesters.
That's a year ago.
And almost a year ago, those protesters who were protesting for a more liberal Ukraine were shot down, not by pro-Russian snipers, but by far-right snipers linked to our intelligence services here in this country, to MI6, no doubt.
Well, have you got any evidence for that?
I've got evidence that MI6 was involved in such activities in the past.
That's not evidence for Kiev, is it?
But the point is, I suggest that if people want to look about what to do to solve this crisis, they need to look nearer to home than to Moscow.
Well, the BBC...
But this crisis has been escalated at every stage by neocon provocateurs in our intelligence
Martin, the BBC
not in the Russian intelligence.
Newsnight earlier this week, I think it was Wednesday evening, had a report all about a year on from the Kiev coup, where they explained that in fact they spoke to some guy who was his face was hidden, who said that he was one of the snipers and they were firing near the police but not at the police. One of the experts used in that was the guy who was in charge of security at the Maidan protests. That's Anton Paribi.
Yes, well, Paribi has been put in by the BBC. Paribi is a suspect for this. So the guy
why is he a suspect?
Because it was Pravi sector were in control of the places where all the shooting was coming from. Now, Omas Pietz, who was the Estonian foreign minister, was bugged phoning Catherine Ashton, who was the British foreign representative of the EU, and he said he'd been round the hospitals, and what he was hearing from everybody was that all of the people had been shot by the same people using the same caliber weapons, and they were professional snipers, and the word he was getting in the hospitals was it was all coming from areas under the control of Paribi and Pravi sector. You see, the neo-Nazis are not in full control in the Ukraine. It's an alliance between neoliberal economist types and neo-Nazis. The neo-Nazis are in charge, though, of the police, the security and the military policy. And they, of course, have a vested interest in escalating. And they, of course, are in alliance with people like John McCain in order to escalate. I mean, the way for this ceasefire to break down is quite simple. They just won't recognise it. They'll just carry on fighting. And that, of course, that's what John McCain wants them to do. And he said they are using cluster bombs. John McCain the other day said, yes, we know they're using cluster bombs on civilians, but that's because we didn't give them proper weaponry. I mean, that's the sort of stuff he comes out with. And, of course, he's also an ally of ISIS. He's met with al-Baghdadi. There's photographs of him. So the far right in the US are in alliance with the far right in the Ukraine and the far right Islamists in Syria. And then they want to say, oh, well, you can see the pernicious and evil actions that they're carrying out. And the Russians have been very, very patient under a great deal of provocation. And I'm afraid the problem for Merkel and Hollande is they've gone along with this nonsense over a whole year, and it's very hard now for them to step back from all the silly things they've said. For example, we could come back to the MH17 shoot down. The evidence is overwhelming that it was carried out by Kiev. Now, what may happen as we go to real confrontation between Russia and the West is that the Russians are going to get out their satellite images, their telephone intercepts, and all the rest of it, and prove beyond any shadow of a doubt to Western public opinion that their own intelligence services are terrorists. And they don't want to do that because it's a very extreme step. But ultimately, of course, what we're talking about is our leaders being sent to Nuremberg.
Made in Bristol. This is BCFM 93.2.